They said no one could fly the Raptor there, not through that corridor, not with those defenses waiting like steel teeth in the dark. Every simulation ended in fire. Every pilot who tried came back silent or didn't come back at all. So when the last transmission crackled through the ops room, "We're cut off, no way out," everyone knew what it meant. The mission was over. At least, that's what they thought, until Ghost-9 stood up. She didn't wait for orders. She didn't ask for clearance, because when she reached for the Raptor's controls, there was no question of if, only how fast she could get there before it was too late. This is the story, Scape, where forgotten legends take the stick and the sky remembers their names. If you live for low-level thunder, impossible odds, and the kind of pilots who don't wave off, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and strap in. What you're about to hear isn't about a machine. It's about the moment a woman and her hog drew the line. And before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world you watching from today? The first warning came in as static, a faint hiss in the comms room that made every operator freeze. Then the voice broke through, strained, clipped, already on the edge. Shadow team to command, position compromised, hostiles in the air and on the ridges, multiple SAM-locks, we can't break the corridor. Silence followed, the kind that stretches across a room like a shadow. Monitors flickered with fragmented telemetry, half-complete maps, broken altitude markers, and intermittent pings from drones that couldn't hold the feed for more than a few seconds. A captain at the far end of the table exhaled slowly and set his pen down. They're boxed in, no air cover. No one argued. They didn't need to. Everyone in that tent knew why the route was impossible. The so-called Draken Corridor wasn't just a stretch of hostile airspace. It was a gauntlet, a place where geography and technology worked together to kill anything that tried to pass. The corridor was barely 30 miles long, but it was ringed with sheer rock faces on both sides, each peak seated with radar-guided anti-air systems and mobile launchers. Thermals from the valley floor threw up unpredictable vertical currents that could toss even the most stable aircraft off course. And the sky above, patrolled by interceptors that could close the gap in under 2 minutes. In every simulation ever run, the outcome was the same, red icons swallowing green. No pilot survived it on paper, let alone in the real sky. On the big screen, the last drone feed stuttered, frames freezing on the sight of black plumes curling upward from somewhere deep in the pass. A voice, quieter this time, came from the far left comm station. They're asking for final relay, messages to families. Someone swore under their breath. Another officer turned away, jaw tight.
Even in the world of special operations, there were places no one could reach in time. This was one of them. Then, from the back of the room, a voice cut through the weight in the air. "No," it said. Heads turned. Major Rena Hale stood there, arms loose at her sides, eyes locked on the flickering map. Her flight suit bore the dust and grease of a day spent in the hangars, not the briefing room. She'd been silent since the first transmission, but now the stillness had broken. "We're not leaving them there." Colonel Wyatt, the operations lead, blinked like he'd misheard. "Major Hale, you know what that corridor is." "I've flown it," she replied, voice even. "Not in combat, not with those defenses live, but I've been through it." A murmur rippled through the room. Someone from Intel said, "That was in training, years ago, and you were flying a Phantom, not a Raptor," she finished for him. "Yes, and that's the difference." The colonel straightened. "You're suggesting you take the F-22 into a live corridor that's killed every attempt before it, alone." Her eyes didn't leave the map. "I'm saying it's the only aircraft fast enough to break the lock before the missiles hit. And I'm the only pilot who's mapped the wind patterns in that pass without instruments." There was an audible scoff from one of the air planners. "The corridor's not about speed, it's about invisibility. They'll see you before you see them." Hale's lips curved, not quite a smile. "They won't see me at all." Someone muttered the old call sign under their breath. Ghost-9. It was a name that hadn't been spoken in years, not in front of her, not since the incident that had put her on the ground and kept her there, working as an instructor, far from operational sorties. No one ever said what happened in the official reports, but the legend, whispered in mess halls and simulators, said she'd flown a route so low and so fast that the ground radars never caught her until she was already gone. That day, the nickname had stuck. Now she looked around the room, reading the doubt on every face. "You've got 6 minutes before Shadow Team runs out of places to hide. I can be there in 4. Colonel Wyatt's stare was long, measured. "Rena, if you go in there—" "I'm not asking," she said. For a heartbeat, the tent was silent except for the low hum of equipment. Then, with a short nod from the colonel, the decision was made. Get her bird ready. Hale was already moving before the words finished leaving his mouth. Outside, the night air was cold against the heat of the hangar lights. Somewhere in the shadows of Bay 2, the Raptor waited. Sleek, predatory, the kind of machine built for the airspace no one else could survive.
Its skin drank in the light, edges melting into darkness, like it already knew it wasn't meant to be seen. As she crossed the tarmac, a young crew chief jogged to meet her. "Ma'am, you're really taking it into the corridor?" She didn't break stride. "Is it ready?" He hesitated, then handed her a small, worn patch, black fabric embroidered with a pale shape that could have been a hawk or a ghost. It read simply, Ghost-9. "Figured you'd want this," he said. She took it without looking down, sliding it into the sleeve pocket of her flight suit. "Thanks." Inside the cockpit, everything went quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when you close the door on the rest of the world and know the next sound you hear will be your own engine taking you somewhere no one else is willing to go. Her hands moved over the controls, every motion practiced, fluid. On the HUD, the route glowed in faint lines, most of it red. She knew better than to follow them exactly. Over the radio, the tower's voice was steady, but not without weight. Ghost-9 cleared for immediate takeoff, Vector 2-1 direct, Godspeed. The engines came alive, a deep predatory growl rising into a scream as she pushed the throttles forward. The Raptor surged, nose lifting, darkness swallowing her whole. Somewhere beyond the ridges, Shadow Team was still alive, barely. And the one corridor no pilot would cross was about to get a visitor. The Raptor sliced into the night like it was built for darkness alone. At 30,000 feet, the lights of the base were already gone, replaced by the infinite black of a sky without a moon. Hale's helmet pressed light against her brow as she scanned the HUD, but her eyes kept shifting to the real horizon. Glass was just reference. The truth was in the air, in the way it moved around her. The first 20 miles were easy, straight climb, clean sky, no interference. Then the radar warning light blinked amber. Not a lock yet, just a sweep. She stayed level, letting the Raptor's stealth coating and edges do their work. Against most systems, the F-22 was a ghost, an absence where an aircraft should be. But in the Draken Corridor, stealth alone wasn't enough. The peaks held old systems modified with newer software, infrared search and track arrays designed to sniff heat signatures instead of radar returns. She could disappear from a screen, but not from the sky itself. The map on her HUD showed the mouth of the corridor as a narrow slash between two jagged ridges. From here, it looked like a blade stuck into the earth, the opening no wider than a handful of football fields. Once she crossed that threshold, the sky wouldn't be hers anymore. Hale dropped altitude. 27,000, 25, 22.
The air thickened,
the Raptor's control surfaces responding with that liquid precision that no other jet could match. She eased the throttles forward, climbing speed instead of height. Mach 1.1, Mach 1.3. The Raptor's body didn't shudder like older airframes. It slid forward as if the air itself was letting it pass. In her ear, the comms hissed. A faint, broken voice forced its way through. Shadow, east wall, tracking, multiple. Static swallowed the rest. She keyed the mic. Shadow, this is Ghost-9. Hold your ground. 2 minutes. No answer. The transmission range in the corridor was a cruel joke. Once she passed the mouth, the walls would eat every signal until she was close enough for line-of-sight comms. The radar warning light blinked again, red this time. Lock attempt, high angle, somewhere on the north ridge. She didn't bother with countermeasures yet. Instead, she cut power by a fraction, letting her thermal output drop just enough to confuse the track. The lock faded. She smiled faintly inside the helmet. They were good, but she was better. The terrain rose ahead, black against black. She leveled at 14,000 feet and nosed down hard. Gravity and thrust tangled in her chest as the G-force pressed her spine into the seat. The peaks rushed upward, filling the canopy with jagged edges. At the last second, she rolled 30 degrees left and slipped between 2 ridges with barely 20 meters clearance on either wingtip. The corridor swallowed her whole. Inside, the world changed. The air became violent, gusts slamming at the Raptor from nowhere, thermals lifting one wing then dropping it without warning. Her HUD blinked with proximity warnings, but she ignored them. The Raptor wasn't built for low-altitude knife flights like this, not in its doctrine, but in her hands the jet felt lighter than it had any right to. Every roll, every pitch was an instinct honed in years of flying close to the ground when no one else would. On the third bend, she saw the first heat signature. Upper ridge, port side, shoulder-mounted SAM, 2 spotters. They hadn't even looked down yet. She slid beneath their arc, so low that the terrain-following radar screamed at her. They never knew she was there. Her mind broke the corridor into beats. 5 turns, 2 straight drops, a split ridge fork, then the bend where Shadow Team was pinned. Every second had to be perfect. One wrong climb and the heat trackers would light her up. One wrong descent and she'd hit rock before she even saw it. She took the split ridge fork at Mach 1.4, wings carving the air like a blade. On the far side, the valley floor opened just enough to show her the flare of gunfire in the distance. Shadow Team. They were dug in under the south wall, muzzle flashes sparking like fireflies in a storm, the enemy pressing from both above and across the floor. She cut power again, dropping into the thermal shadow at the base of the ridge. From here, the enemy couldn't see her until she wanted them to. Her thumb hovered over the weapon select. The Raptor's 20mm M61A2 cannon wasn't the brute force beast of the A-10's GAU-8, but at this speed and altitude, it could turn a firing line into shrapnel before they knew what hit them. A voice burst into her headset, clearer now, desperate. Whoever's out there, North Ridge is loaded with launchers. We're dead if they get one more volley. Hale's reply was calm, almost steady. Negative. You're not dead yet. She rolled left, pulling the nose up into a climbing turn that carried her straight at the North Ridge. The first crew saw her too late, just the glint of canopy glass before the cannon lit up. Tracer fire stitched across the slope, tearing through sandbags and scattering bodies. The survivors broke and ran, leaving their launchers in the dirt. Her radar lit again, 2 locks from the east wall. She didn't break formation. Instead, she rolled the Raptor onto its back, dived inverted, and snapped upright 100 feet above the valley floor, the locks losing her in the chaos of rock, speed, and shadow. Team leader's voice came back, this time full of adrenaline. "Ghost-9, you're a damn phantom. Do it again." She didn't answer. She was already banking for another pass. The moment Rena cleared the north ridge, she knew the fight had shifted. The gun positions were broken, but the silence that followed wasn't relief, it was calculation. Somewhere deeper in the corridor, new players were moving into place. Her threat display lit with two distinct signals, mobile anti-air units rolling down from the eastern approach. These weren't the hastily hidden shoulder launchers she just shredded. These were heavier platforms, each capable of sending radar-guided missiles up the throat of the valley and locking onto her even through the chaos of the terrain. She had seconds, maybe less, before they settled into position and turned the narrow channel into a killbox. She dropped the Raptor low again, riding the turbulent air at barely 300 feet, letting the cliff walls eat most of her radar profile. The mountains here were brutal, jagged, and close enough to make the HUD proximity alerts flash almost constantly. She ignored them. The only way to survive this pass was to stay in the folds of the terrain, moving too fast and too unpredictably for the tracking systems to calculate a firing solution. Her hands were steady, but her jaw was tight. Speed was her ally, but in this kind of geography, speed could kill just as easily.
Ahead, the valley kinked into a sharp S-curve, the kind of turn that punished anything moving faster than a helicopter. In training, the safe play was always to climb above it, sacrificing stealth for maneuvering room. But climbing here meant breaking cover, and the instant she did, those eastern platforms would have her locked and fired upon. She kept low. At the first bend, the Raptor's wingtips skimmed invisible pressure ridges, the whole airframe flexing under the load. At the second, she bled just enough speed to pivot through without scraping the rock. The G-force pulled hard at her shoulders, but the jet responded like it had been waiting for someone willing to push it this far. As she came out of the turn, the threat indicators flared again, solid lock both platforms. The missile warning screamed across her headset. She didn't need to look up. She could almost feel the launch, the faint tremor in the air as the first pair of warheads cut loose from their rails. Her countermeasures were limited, and infrared flares wouldn't mean much against radar seekers this close. She didn't plan to dodge them in the air. Instead, she banked hard toward the eastern wall, hugging the rock until the shadow of the cliff swallowed her completely. The missiles followed the predicted trajectory into the open channel, never adjusting fast enough to account for her sudden disappearance. They streaked past her position and detonated harmlessly against the far ridge in a flash of shattered stone. It bought her seconds, nothing more. The mobile units were still crawling into better lines of fire. Below them, she spotted the problem Shadow Team hadn't seen yet. An entire secondary ambush forming along the southern wall, right in the path of their planned retreat. It was textbook. Force the ground unit to move out of cover, then box them in from both sides. If she waited until the eastern threat was neutralized, the southern wall would cut them off completely. She had to take both in one sequence, or the mission was over. The solution came as instinct, not calculation. She pushed the Raptor into a climbing arc, as if she intended to loop back toward the east, letting the mobile platforms commit their guns to her. As they rotated to track, she rolled inverted, dropped power, and let the jet fall into a diving spiral that carried her across the width of the corridor at a speed that made the airframe groan in protest. The twist brought her out along the southern wall, where the ambush line was still half hidden by camouflage netting and rocky overhangs. Her targeting system picked up the heat signatures instantly, painting them in red on the HUD. She armed the cannon and opened fire in a sustained burst, sweeping the line from left to right.
The netting erupted into flame, ammunition stores cooking off in violent pops, fighters scattering for whatever cover they could find.
Before the dust had even cleared, she was already climbing again, angling back toward the east. The mobile platforms had repositioned, clearly anticipating a second strike. But their gunners hadn't accounted for the fact that she'd be attacking from above the ridge rather than through the valley. The Raptor's speed bled just enough to let her pivot into a shallow dive, each gun pass lasting barely a heartbeat before she broke line of sight again. It took 3 such passes to cripple both platforms, their smoldering wrecks tumbling halfway down the slope. Shadow Team's leader's voice broke through at last, clearer now that she was closer to their position. "Ghost-9, south wall is clear. We're moving. How long can you keep the air tight?" She checked her fuel. It was already sliding below optimal combat range, but she didn't hesitate. "As long as you need," she replied. She circled once, scanning the ridges for fresh heat blooms. Nothing yet, but she knew better to trust a lull. The corridor was a living thing, and living things waited for you to think you were safe before striking again. She tightened her grip on the stick. The fight wasn't over. In the Draken Corridor, it never was. For nearly 40 seconds, the valley felt empty. The gunfire had stopped, the missile trails had faded, and the jagged walls seemed to stand in watchful silence. Rena knew better to believe in that kind of quiet. In the Draken Corridor, silence wasn't peace. It was the inhale before a strike. Her HUD still showed no fresh locks, no active radar sweeps, but a faint vibration through the stick told her the air was shifting. The wind coming off the eastern ridges had changed pitch, moving in sharp, irregular bursts. That meant something big was maneuvering into position ahead. She climbed slightly, just enough to see over the curve of the next bend without breaking her cover entirely. The sight that met her confirmed what she'd suspected. 2 armored technicals parked nose to nose across a natural choke point in the valley floor, each fitted with makeshift missile rails. Behind them, in the shadow of the ridge, sat something worse. A fixed, triple-barrel anti-air gun, the kind designed to chew apart fast movers in a heartbeat. The technicals would block Shadow Team's only ground exit, while the gunner would ensure any air support, including her, wouldn't survive long enough to help. There was no room for hesitation. She dipped the nose and dove straight at the gap between the technicals. The gunners scrambled to track her, but the Raptor's speed erased the distance before they could steady their aim. At 400 knots, she pulled the trigger, a short, controlled burst from the M61A2 stitching through the first truck, ripping its chassis apart. Shrapnel and fire bloomed outward, slamming into the second vehicle and sending it spinning sideways into the rock wall. One obstruction down, but the anti-air gunner had already swung his barrels toward her. The first salvo of shells ripped past her left wing, close enough that she felt the Raptor's frame shiver from the shockwave. She rolled hard right, cutting across the line of fire but not fast enough to avoid the second burst entirely. Something slammed into her aft section, and warning lights flared across the console. Stealth skin damage, possible stabilizer hit. The Raptor remained flyable, but the hit had compromised her low absorbable profile. From here on, any radar sweep would catch her instantly. The triple-barrel gun was still firing, sweeping arcs across the bend like a steel storm. Climbing out wasn't an option. She'd be a glowing target against the open sky. Dropping lower would pin her in the kill zone. She needed a third option, one that no training manual would endorse. She cut throttle just enough to drop under the weapon's tracking speed, banking into the shadow of the eastern wall. From there, she pitched the nose up at an aggressive angle and kicked the rudder, using the cliff's own face as a partial shield. The maneuver scraped her left wing so close to the rock she felt the vibration in her teeth, but it masked her position long enough for the gunner to swing his barrels wide. By the time they realized their mistake, she was already inverted above them, rolling into a perfect firing line. A 2-second burst was all it took. The barrels twisted off their mount, the gunner's position erupting in fire and debris. The anti-air threat was gone, but the damage to her aircraft was real.
Control response was slower now, and the warning on her stabilizer readout was solid red. She leveled out and scanned for Shadow Team. They were on the move, sprinting across the open floor toward the far southern bend, but they were exposed. The ridge above them was crawling with enemy fighters, each trying to get into position for a downward shot. If even one of them reached the ledge, they could sweep the valley with automatic fire and pin the seals in place until reinforcements arrived. Rena pushed the throttles forward, closing the gap in seconds. She came in low, almost skimming the tops of the boulders, then pulled into a shallow climb that put her directly between the ledge and the advancing ground team. The fighters saw her too late. The cannon's bursts ripped through their line, tearing away the loose shale beneath their feet. Several lost their footing and tumbled down the slope. The rest scattered back into the rocks, leaving the ridge momentarily clear. Over comms, Shadow Team's leader shouted through the static, "We're at the LZ. 2 minutes until extraction birds arrive." That was the good news. The bad news came from the tone in his voice. He knew the valley walls were going to light up again the second those birds came into range. The extraction helicopters would be massive targets, slow to maneuver and easy to hit if even one launcher was still operational.
Rena banked into a wide arc, scanning the ridges for any sign of a prepared shot. Her eyes caught it instantly, a cluster of heat signatures moving along the western wall, high above the LZ. One launcher was already being shouldered, the operator's silhouette sharp against the fading light. She had seconds, maybe less, before the shot was fired. The Raptor's missile systems were empty. She'd burned through her last 2 air-to-ground rounds, neutralizing the mobile platforms earlier. All she had left was speed, the cannon, and the willingness to fly closer to that wall than any sane pilot ever would. She nosed in toward the ridge, closing the distance so fast the world became a smear of rock and shadow. The launcher's muzzle flared. He'd fired. She yanked the stick, rolling the Raptor sideways to pass directly between the missile and its target. The shockwave slapped the jet like a giant's hand, rattling the cockpit. The missile veered wide and detonated harmlessly in midair. The operator never got a chance to reload. Her return burst erased him and his team from the ledge entirely. Below, the extraction LZ was clear for now, but the clock was still running. The birds would be inbound in less than a minute, and there was no telling how many more shooters were waiting just out of sight. She wasn't finished. Not yet. The first thump of rotor blades came faint through the din of her cockpit, a deep rhythmic pulse that told her the extraction birds were almost in visual range. The CH-47s would come in heavy and low, riding the valley floor to avoid detection until the last possible moment. But in a place like the Draken Corridor, the enemy didn't need much warning. One glint of glass, one slip of noise, and the helicopters would be lit up by every launcher within a mile. Her job wasn't just to protect the seals, it was to make sure the LZ remained invisible, unreachable, and untouched for as long as it took to get them out. She checked her systems. Fuel sat deep in the red, giving her maybe 7 minutes of combat flight at current throttle. Hydraulic pressure on the left stabilizer was bleeding away. Every time she rolled hard, the control lag stretched a fraction of a second longer. Her radar cross-section was no longer ghost slick. The earlier hit to the stealth skin meant she was visible to any radar still sweeping the ridges. The Raptor was wounded, and so was she, though she refused to let herself think about the ache in her right shoulder from the last high-G maneuver. She'd landed harder hits in training and flown through worse in silence. Pain was a passenger, not a pilot. As the CH-47s rounded the southern bend, the valley woke up. Heat blooms flared along the western and northern walls, small teams rushing to get launchers into position. Some were already setting up tripods, others hauling heavy weapons toward natural ledges. The helicopters were still seconds from touchdown, but in a fight like this, seconds were a luxury they didn't have. Rena dropped the Raptor into a low pass along the western wall, her shadow crawling over the rock face as the cannon barked in precise bursts. Each strike shattered the edge of a firing position, sending stone and body spilling into the ravine below. She rolled into a climbing turn, switching to the northern wall before the gunners there could lock their sights on the birds.
The first missile launched before she was in line to fire, its smoke trail cutting straight toward the lead CH-47. She reacted without thought, diving hard and dragging the Raptor between the missile and its target. The counterforce wave from the detonation slammed into her canopy, but the helicopter remained untouched. "Ghost-9, you just saved my rotors," came a pilot's voice over the net, breathless. She didn't reply. She didn't have the bandwidth for conversation, not with the ridges lighting up like this. She swept the northern wall again, firing short, savage bursts to break up the next launch attempt. The canyon echoed with overlapping thunder, the pounding of her cannon, the thrum of the helicopters, the muffled crump of detonations hitting stone. Every enemy she took down seemed to be replaced by two more crawling out of the rock like ants. They weren't trying to beat her outright anymore. They were trying to keep her busy, force her to choose between protecting one flank and leaving the other open. The helicopters touched down in a blast of dust and rotor wash, the SEALs sprinting toward their ramps with the clipped urgency of soldiers who knew exactly how thin the margin was. Rena banked into another low run, strafing a ridge that had begun to flash with rifle fire. She clipped the tree line so closely that branches whipped against the fuselage, but she stayed locked on her targets until the last muzzle flash winked out. The extraction team called it in, first bird loaded, lifting off. She adjusted her orbit, staying tight over the LZ to block any line of sight from the ridges. Her sensors screamed a new warning. Heat signature, spiked to the northeast, a man-portable launcher, almost in range. She didn't have time for a clean approach. Instead, she cut her throttle entirely, letting gravity drop her like a stone toward the target, then reignited both engines at full military power in the final 2 seconds. The acceleration snapped her body against the seat, but it carried her into a perfect line. One squeeze of the trigger, and the launcher team was gone.
Below, the second helicopter was halfway loaded, rotor blades chewing the air into a cyclone of grit. The valley floor was chaos, dust hanging thick, visibility down to meters, the constant rattle of small arms fire from unseen angles. Rena circled again, slower this time, letting her eyes pick apart every movement on the ridges. A single figure broke cover on the north wall, hefting a launcher tube onto his shoulder. She fired without hesitation. The flash was gone before he could even find his aim. "Second bird clear," the extraction lead shouted. Both CH-47s began to climb, their rotors forcing the dust into spiraling columns that turned the LZ into a shifting brown haze. Rena stayed just above them, her Raptor an armored shadow guiding them toward the mouth of the corridor. She wasn't leaving until she knew nothing could follow. Her HUD showed no active locks, no visible launch signatures, but she didn't trust it. This place had a way of hiding its teeth until the very end. She kept her eyes on the ridges, her cannon armed, her body tuned for one more fight if it came. The corridor had thrown everything it had at her, and she was still here, for now. The Draken Corridor narrowed into its final stretch, the ridges pressing close like the jaws of a trap. The CH-47 stayed low, hugging the valley floor, their rotors beating a constant war rhythm. Rena's Raptor flew just ahead and slightly above, the wounded aircraft cutting through the turbulence like a predator still on the hunt. Every gauge on her console told her she was burning through the last of her reserves, fuel dangerously low, left stabilizer control degraded to barely functional, stealth compromised, but those were problems for later. Right now she had one job: get the birds out. The mouth of the corridor was still 3 miles away when the valley came alive again. Heat signatures flared on both sides, not in scattered pockets this time, but in coordinated clusters. They'd been waiting for this moment, the exfil's final sprint. Any hit here wouldn't just damage a helicopter, it would trap the SEALs in the open, with nowhere to run. Rena felt the shift in the air before she saw the first missile launch, a telltale distortion in the dust cloud. She was already rolling into a dive as the trail of smoke streaked toward the trailing CH-47. There was no time to intercept conventionally. She dropped beneath the helicopters, cutting so close to the ground that the Raptor's shadow merged with theirs. The missile seeker lost the higher, hotter target and snapped toward her.
She dumped the last of her flares, angling the Raptor into a sharp climb that forced the missile to overcorrect. It missed by less than 10 meters, detonating in a flare of heat and shattered rock that rocked the valley walls. The reprieve lasted seconds. 3 more launch signatures bloomed from the North Ridge, all aimed at the lead bird. Rena had no countermeasures left, no ordnance to spare, and no altitude to burn. She turned toward the threat head-on, the Raptor's engines roaring into afterburner, despite the warning lights screaming on her panel. The climb was violent, the kind that pulled at muscle and bone, but it carried her above the ridgeline in time to bring the cannon to bear. The first burst tore through the launch crews mid-reload, the second stitched across a bunker entrance, sealing it in fire and debris. The third team scattered before they could even shoulder their tubes. Below, the helicopters pushed forward, rotors clawing at the thin mountain air. The mouth of the corridor was in sight now, a jagged cut opening into the darker shape of the surrounding range. It looked like freedom, but Rena knew better. Ambushes at thresholds were the oldest trick in the book. She shifted her focus ahead, scanning for any sign of movement in the rocky teeth of the exit. She found it. 2 technicals tucked into a shallow ravine just beyond the opening, each armed with a heavy machine gun. From this position, they could rake the birds as they emerged, cutting them down in seconds. No time to call it in, no time to wait. She banked hard, pushing the Raptor into a high-speed dive that flattened into a pass just feet above the ground. The cannon fire was surgical, a short, controlled burst that shredded the trucks before they could open fire. One erupted into flame, the other flipped sideways, its gunner scrambling away. The CH-47s cleared the mouth of the corridor, climbing into the open sky where a friendly escort flight waited to take them the rest of the way home. For the first time in hours, the pressure in Rena's chest eased. Her job was done. She keyed her mic, voice level but edged with fatigue. Ghost-9 to all call signs, package clear. Repeat, package clear. Now it was just her and the Raptor. The damage was worse than she had admitted even to herself. The control lag had grown, the left stabilizer barely responding. Fuel was so low her range to base was a guess at best. She turned for home anyway, coaxing the jet along like an injured animal. Every mile felt longer than the last, but the sight of the runway at last was enough to tighten her grip and push through. The landing was ugly. The Raptor hit the tarmac hard, tires screaming, stabilizer shuddering under the strain. She fought the roll with every ounce of precision she had left, keeping the bird straight until the speed bled away. When the jet finally stopped, there was a long moment of stillness, the kind where no one on the ground moves, afraid that one wrong step might break the spell. Then the canopy opened, and she stood.
Her flight suit was streaked with dust and hydraulic fluid, helmet under one arm, hair damp against her forehead. She climbed down slowly, not from weakness, but from the weight of the mission still running through her. The crew chiefs and medics didn't rush her. They just watched, taking in the fact that she was standing here at all. No one had flown the Raptor through the Draken Corridor before. No one had even tried. The debrief was short and tense. Command wanted to know how she'd done it. She offered only the bare facts: routes, timings, the order of targets. The rest, the instinct and the risk, didn't fit neatly into the report. But the SEALs didn't need a written record. They knew exactly what she'd done. Within a day, helmet cam footage from one of the helicopters had surfaced. A grainy shot of her Raptor sliding through the corridor like a phantom, cannon spitting fire. The caption was simple: Ghost-9 lives. 3 days later, she was back in the air. No ceremony, no parade, just another sortie on the roster. But the ground crews looked up when she passed, and the younger pilots watched her walk to the jet like they were seeing something out of legend. She didn't correct them. Legends had their place, and the Draken Corridor had its first.
When a new cadet finally asked her why she'd gone, when everyone else said it couldn't be done, she thought for a long moment before answering. Because the sky doesn't belong to the ones who wait. It belongs to the ones who take it back.